Hi, I want you to consider this situation. You are the listing broker. Your seller has been reluctant to follow your advice to lower the price to attract a desirable buyer. The property has languished on the market some, and eventually your seller does receive an offer from an undesirable buyer. In the example I'm giving you, the buyer is undesirable because the buyer has an existing house that they need to sell. So your seller wants to have the ability to, on the one hand, accept the offer, but on the other hand, kick out this first buyer, buyer number one, if a more desirable buyer number two comes along. The industry responds to this sort of situation by countering the offer from the first buyer, by countering with a clause that the industry tends to call a right of first refusal. It's not a true right of first refusal, which I'll explain in a minute. What I would encourage you to do is think of these things as a kick-out clause. A true right of first refusal is not something that gives the seller the right to kick out the buyer. A true right of first refusal is something that gives the buyer, buyer number one, the right to match terms of a second buyer coming along. And that's not what's going on in these situations. Buyer number one already has the property under contract to buy. Buyer number one does not need to have a right to match the terms of other offers. These clauses that brokers are creating are not intended to burden the seller like a true right of first refusal. These clauses are intended to benefit the seller by giving the seller the ability to kick out buyer number one. Once you think of these things as a kick-out clause, it forces you to address the two kinds of issues that the seller needs to address in a kick-out clause. The first one is, what must buyer number one do after buyer number one is notified of a buyer number two? What must buyer number one do to avoid getting kicked out of the transaction? Does buyer number one need to waive the home sale contingency for the house that the buyer number one needs to sell? Does buyer number one need to waive the home sale contingency and the loan objection contingency? Does buyer number one need to waive the loan objection contingency, the home sale contingency, and the appraisal contingency? Maybe buyer number one needs to waive all those things plus any other contingencies and put up earnest money. There isn't one answer to that, but those are the negotiating points. The first issue in a kick-out clause is, what does buyer number one need to do to avoid being kicked out? The second issue in a kick-out clause is, what does the seller need to do to get the clock ticking against buyer number one? Typically, buyer number one has 72 hours or 48 hours to waive the contingencies, whatever time period it is. Does the seller merely need to provide notice that the seller has received another offer? Does the seller need to provide notice that the seller has received an offer from another buyer without a home sale contingency? Does the seller have to provide a copy of the other offer from buyer number two to buyer number one? Again, there is not one answer to those questions. Those are all the points of negotiation. These situations are complicated. They are fraught because if they are successful, buyer number one, who already had their tentacles in the property, is being kicked out of the transaction, and they're going to resent that. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on the language that you draft. It's complicated. I do not suggest that you draft these clauses on your own. My self-serving suggestion, please excuse my slimy lawyery marketing, is that you check out my law firm's addenda system and clause library. We have kick-out clauses in there. All right, that's it. That's the spiel for today. Remember, we live in a complex world. Be careful out there.